Monster Professor.
Welcome back to The Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, folklore, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert, and the podcast has been in winter hibernation for a little while, and we're coming back in 2020 with an episode today and many very cool episodes lined up. We even have a Monster Professor event lining up in Halloween. More details in future episodes soon, but 2020 is going to be a really cool next stage in this podcast. So thank you for being a listener, and please remember to like and subscribe and share and help me out in any way you can if you like the show to keep it going. Today, I'm excited to talk with Valerie Nieman, and you can check her out at her website. The link's in the description below. Valerie Nieman is a professor of English at North Carolina A&T State University, former journalist, former farmer in West Virginia, and she's written novels, books, short story poetry, and she's a graduate of West Virginia University, received an MFA from Queen's University of Charlotte, and her recent book, To the Bones, is a novel, and it gets into some dark, gritty, supernatural folklore of the West Virginia area. It's some really cool Southern Gothic, essentially. And so I get to talk with her about that. We dig into local folklore, local monsters, and the role that the supernatural and the dark and the gritty and the monstrous can play in your work as a creative writer, or in your reading if you're a reader, or in the forests around you and the mines under your feet. I hope you enjoy. So let's get to it. First of all, Valerie Nieman, thank you so much for coming on The Monster Professor. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's a delight to be here. Thank you.
I think a lot of our connections came through a mutual publisher of ours, Press 53. Although, if I have my numbers right, you've got books through other publishers as well. 4 novels and 3 books of poetry. Is that right?
That's correct. I have 4 novels, 3 of which are in print, one of which came back to life rather zombie-like. We can talk about that. 3 books of poetry, and a book of short stories. I always forget about that because it's sort of the oddball.
And one of the main reasons I'm excited about talking with you is To the Bones, which is dark and somehow both realistic and supernatural in some really fascinating ways. I was curious if you could give us a rundown and a synopsis of what's going on in To the Bones.
Well, we draw on our own life history when we write often, and I went to school in West Virginia at West Virginia University. And then I moved a little bit south of there to Marion County, where I had a small farm with my husband at the time and worked for the newspaper. And so this territory is really where To the Bones emerges, because the things that are in there, the coal barrens, the pollution of the rivers, the subsidence of houses into, the coal mines as they collapse, the corruption. Now, none of it is as bad as the book. It's a bit heightened. Actually, it's quite a bit heightened. But it does draw on a very, very realistic setting, one that I knew for many years. What I wanted to do with it, it got started when I was really kind of having a hard time getting going on a new book. I was flailing around and making some false starts and generally kvetching about, I can't get going and I don't think this is working, et cetera, et cetera. And at some point, I don't know why, I was talking with a friend And I said something about, when I lived on the farm, we had a mine crack in the back field. And I always said if I was going to kill somebody, I'd throw them down the mine crack.
Yeah, I'm glad you had that planned out.
And yeah, well, that's where the deer carcasses went. It was a great place to dispose of things. And so he said, well, do it. And it was like a little shock, like, I can do it. I can. And so that was the genesis. And so, of course, once you've got somebody who's been thrown down a mine crack, you had to figure out, who is this person? Why were they thrown down the mine crack? Do they get out, and what happens next? So that just got the book going. And I think I kind of, let it develop in its own way. I did plot it out. I did, plan for the major points to happen. But a lot of things happened, of course, that I didn't expect. And characters developed in ways I didn't expect. But I wanted to play with a lot of the cliches, the stereotypes of horror and mystery and Appalachian literature. And so we have the hero, or, there are really two main characters, but the man gets off the highway at the wrong exit, like those movies.
Yeah. And
he offends people in some way at a convenience store. He has no idea why, but he's hit over the head. And when he wakes up, he's down in a pit full of bones. And so from there, he does make his way out, or there would be a very, very short book. He makes his way out and staggers toward the lights of town. After holing up for a day or two to recover himself, he says, I've got to get out of here. So he starts staggering down the road. And in the way that things happen like that, he's been hit over the head. He's bloodied. He's battered. He's staggering. And he's seen by a local family out with their kids, and they think he's a zombie. So that's the start of a zombie panic. The Walking Dead are moving the area. They're seen here. They're seen there. They multiply. And that was, a big part of how the book developed, was this whole idea of mistakes, the mistake that puts him in the hole, the mistake that makes him a zombie. And then he sort of blunders into this local situation, which is like nothing he knows. He's an urbanite, works for the government. And here he finds that the coal barons still have great, great power, basically run everything locally. And the person who takes him in against her better judgment is Lurana Taylor, who's looking for her daughter, which is what brings these two together. Her daughter has disappeared, and no one seems to be all that interested in helping find her. So they join forces. A couple of other people are going to get involved, and this unlikely group of 4 people is going to take on the powers that be, the Kavanaugh coal barons who've run this county for generations. And along with the realities, the gritty realities of coal mining and pollution and et cetera, both Derek and the Kavanaughs turn out to have otherworldly powers. Derek's have developed, and he's struggling with that. This is not something he wanted. So we have a supernatural sort of standoff against this gritty backdrop. So that's a long way around to say there's a lot going on in this book, and I drew from a lot of sources, from anything from The Night of the Living Dead, which was filmed not that far away, to Appalachian folktales about coal mines and the things that happen in coal mines and the creatures that live in coal mines. So drawing in a lot of different threads into this story.
Man, and that's an awesome combination. I didn't know Night of the Living Dead was filmed over in those parts, though. That's news to me. Over there in West Virginia?
No, it was north of the border. It was in Pennsylvania.
Oh, well, not too far away, though.
Yeah, south of Pittsburgh. In fact, the area where, often we would go to shop up around that area. The second in the series is filmed at the Monroeville Mall, which was really a shop at the Monroeville Mall. So we were pretty close. And I understand, though I don't know this, I have been told, I have heard that fraternity brothers from West Virginia University were among the zombies. There are some linkages there.
That's cool. And for those listeners who are urbanites, who are New York City folk or LA or what have you, or Chicago, London, you name it, and they're wondering, wow, so the unrealistic elements that we just heard are like hillbillies, like getting offended, hitting you over the head and dumping your body. Well, no, that's actually a lot more realistic than city folk might realize. You go out into the eastern Kentucky hills and you piss someone off. They might just crack you over the head and dump your body in the hills and the swamps and the mines. That stuff still goes on, believe it or not. It's pretty scary.
Well, I think that was, and also part of the thing I wanted to work with is that there is this disconnect between people who Appalachia is the other. So when we talk about doing, dealing with monsters and the other, Appalachia has been for a very long time the other. It's the place where people think things happen, where the people aren't like us, etc. And part of that was fomented by the authorities and the industries, because if you had a population that was considered to be sort of backward and inadequate, then of course you had to, lay down the law and run things to, because they weren't capable. That was part of that whole evolution of the Appalachians as, refuting hillbillies and all of those stories, because it was part of the way of saying, we need to rule here with an iron fist because these people aren't competent. It was sort of a colonial mentality.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of wealth in Appalachia that all went out of Appalachia and went elsewhere. So long as
And it's cool that you're digging into like those kinds of gritty socio-political realities. And so I'll hit you with a question that sometimes every now and then I get hit with, and I know a lot of writers kind of struggle over. You've gotten past it apparently, and I have too, but others might be struggling out there wondering, like, well, if you have all of that to work with and you have good characters to work with, why do you need the supernatural? Why not just cut that out? Like, what does it add to the story you're telling that there are otherworldly powers, say psychic or zombie or these kinds of things? So what's your take? Why add the supernatural? What more does it add to a story?
I think that you're either drawn that way or you're not. My earliest memories of reading things were things that were in the Gothic and supernatural vein, Hawthorne and Poe and Shakespeare, that I found on the shelves in our farmhouse. There were all of these old books, and I read them at a very young age, wildly inappropriate if we wanted to, say what you should be reading. But I was really always drawn to that and the mystery. And I think that mashing together genres like this can be really effective, because you can raise things up. That's the whole idea of the Gothic. The things are highlighted and they're in stronger relief. I mean, we think about Frankenstein and what has been better able to illuminate issues about, man and God, and man thinking that he is God, than Frankenstein. I mean, do we assail the walls of heaven by attempting to make life? And what is the responsibility to that life? And of course, Frankenstein has spun into so many spin-offs since then. But the reason is because it's such a powerful myth and so ingrained into our ideas about science and the world that I don't know how you would, what would a world be like if Frankenstein hadn't been written? I guess somebody would have written something like it. But I think we want to approach things that are in some way difficult or beyond us or hard to understand. And often science fiction, fantasy, and horror lets us do that. My early reading was Ray Bradbury, and he took on all sorts of ideas through, this is happening on Mars. So you don't really, it's not like happening in your neighborhood. It's happening on Mars, but of course it's happening in your neighborhood. It just lets you look at it more clearly because it's the other again.
Yeah, that's well said, because it really does allow you to see through a different lens those things that might just be a little bit too cloudy if you're not looking through that lens. So these sound like cool influences. You're kind of getting to where I wanted to go next. Some of your influences, but since you've been naming some, maybe a slightly different version of the question. So why are you drawn that way? What do you think led you toward these dark, gothic, supernatural, and gritty kinds of stories? Like, why are you scary, Val Nieman?
The thing is, I'm really a happy person. I'm not, I think sometimes you need to be the opposite. Fred Chappell, of course, our wonderful, wonderful writer here in Virginia, who wrote all sorts of things, science fiction, fantasy, horror, mainstream poetry, fiction, and who's been an enormous influence on me. At one point, he was reading something of mine because he's always been very supportive, and he said, wrote a little note. He said that you have a chthonic imagination. And I think it's true. Nearly every book, someone ends up either under the ground, in a cave, in a ditch, for heaven's sake, but people end up going down into the earth in some way. And of course, that's, surely a metaphor for digging into the subconscious and digging into the past. All sorts of things that you can draw out of that. But I definitely have those interests. And even when I travel, I'm not an explorer in terms of like going into a cave, unexplored, but I really enjoy, going into dark and secret places and caves. One of the greatest things that happened to me was to go to France in the area of Lascaux. I didn't go to that because it's a recreation, but I walked the 3 miles out of town 2 mornings in a row to get into the queue to go into Font de Gaume, which is the last painted cave you can actually go into. It's very, very limited. And so I got to go in and stand and look at these walls with the beasts painted on them, the horses and the bison, and the guide showing how if you move the light with the light and the shadow that the animals seemed to move forward. They were walking, they were rolling. And we were crying. I looked at the woman next to me and realized she was crying, and then I realized I was too. It was so powerful down there in that secret well of humanity where we, first started to put images out into the world. So yeah, I tend to try to find those kind of places.
Yeah, there is something immensely powerful about that underground. The moment you take a reader or a character into a world of underground, like I've been trying to sort that out myself for quite a while, and that helps kind of clear it up too. It's like something about the underground world, or those monsters that are living underground exist in this kind of timeless space. Like when you got to go in that cave, you got to go back 10,000 years, more than that even. You got to be in that moment, and then you emerge and you're coming back out into the world proper. But even as far back as some of the myths, whether it's, I don't know, even, Odysseus going into the underworld, or Aeneas, Orpheus, and emerging, something about the moment they're down there, it's like this strange, timeless, suspended space.
And it's still there. People, you look at movies, Us, and there's this whole subterranean society that mirrors the world above that's been created. We're still wanting to go underground and find out where we came from, or where the secrets lie, or where the oracle is that can tell us the truth.
Yeah. So how about, as a really experienced writer and as someone who has kind of explored, well, all the major genres. You've got, short story, poetry, novel. I know you do some teaching too. Is it true you teach at the John C. Campbell Folk School every now and then? Because if so, I'm a little bit envious of that.
I do. I have taught there for years in the summer. I always try to be there during dance week, so I can be involved in the dancing. I love it a great deal. And so, yeah, I teach fiction, and it's a delight, and it's a wonderful community to be part of and to be among all of these working artists and people interested in these arts and crafts. So I teach there, but my full-time job is teaching at North Carolina A&T State University, where I teach creative writing. So that's what really puts the food on the table. But I do teach at Campbell, and I'm going to start teaching at Wild Acres Writers Workshop, and then I do other shorter sorts of things.
Well, then I'm curious if you could offer us some advice, like anybody out there listening, like, well, I want to make some monsters come to life in stories. I want to make the dark and the supernatural come to life. But that comes with a lot of challenges, a lot of obstacles, everything from not seeming, say, cliche or cheesy down to whether or not the supernatural elements are even clear enough to make sense. It's fraught with difficulties. It's quite difficult to do. I think something that maybe realistic writers don't give non-realistic writers enough credit for. It's quite tough to do well. Is there any advice you could perhaps offer someone worried or struggling with bringing their own monster stories and supernatural stories to life?
I think it's a hazard. It's definitely a hazard. I've always walked that line between genre and literary. I do both. I don't see that you have to separate those. I mean, Fred Chappell, of course, gave me a lot of encouragement, but I look at someone like Margaret Atwood or Doris Lessing, and there's no reason why these have to be so deeply divorced. But it is a hazard. If you want to have monsters or supernatural events, it's so easy for it to be, a parody, for it to be cliche, for it to be, as you say, cheesy. And when I was writing To the Bones, I just tried to write bravely and quickly. I set myself to write quickly and not overthink it, which is a hazard, something I do. And I think I think that I managed to walk that line because I had a reviewer from the horror world who in his first part of the review said that he wasn't sure he was going to like this because it seemed so literary in the beginning. And then in the literary world who said, oh, it was so horrible in the beginning, I didn't know if I could keep going. So if they're each seeing the other thing. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to tell this story using some of the kind of standard. There are vampires of a sort. They're not, Nosferatu, but they're a kind of vampire. And there is a kind of zombie. And that emerges from who they are. The Kavanaughs with their powers emerges from their connection to the coal. And they believe it goes back, far, far in their lineage to when kings actually married the land. The idea that the king's rightful hold on the throne was that his people and his land prospered. And if they did not, then he would be removed because that they were actually wedded together in a ceremony. So that's their accounting for where they gained their special power. Derek is a little more problematic because he had no power that he was aware of until he woke up in that hole. And now he has a terrible and deadly ability that he isn't able to control at first, and finally is able to control, but doesn't understand where it came from. But it does come in part out of his past, who he is, a kid who had a hard time, who was an orphan, who was bullied, who is enraged by, maltreatment of people. He's got there's a kind of missionary zeal about him that is liberated by this power that he can make things right at last. Well, that's really hazardous. Whenever you think, I'm going to use this power to make things right, well, that often doesn't go very well. So I think their powers emerge from who they are and how they perceive themselves and their role in the world. And so I hope I succeeded, but I'm very well aware that working in these areas can be, who was it that said, because Stephen King got involved, I think it was Joe Hill who said that horror is considered to be a second-class citizen, and then Stephen King responded with something like, yes, it's considered a ghetto literature. And then that got a whole lot of, responses flying on Twitter and stuff. But the idea that it is second class. I mean, you see, of course, Frankenstein is taught in literature courses, and, you teach Jane Eyre and you teach Turn of the Screw. Yet there is that sort of taint that it's not quite really literature. It's too, it's just too on the borderlands. It's got, too much entertainment value. So yeah, there is that kind of, and that because you work in the same territories that people, some people are made uncomfortable by pushing that boundary.
Yeah, and I very much feel that kind of funny reaction that you described, where from if you take these kind of genre elements and you do them, in a kind of literary style, then you have perhaps the advantage of both, but you also run into the literary folk who don't like your genre aspect and the genre folk who are freaked out by the literary aspect. And so you do kind of risk running them both away, but I think that risk is worth it. And especially if you're taking that approach like you're doing of like, yeah, there are zombies, there are vampires, but they're your versions of them. You're gonna make these unique things and draw from characters. And I'm kind of curious. I don't really know what my question is about this, but it sounds like as you're letting your stories come to life, you're drawing from this deep well. I mean, you've already mentioned having been influenced greatly by Shakespeare, by Poe and Hawthorne, all the way up to Bradbury. But you're making reference to these perhaps little-known ancient traditions like the king marrying the land. I keep trying to let other writers know and even discuss with, say, RPG game masters the importance of, what was it? What did a fellow say one time? Filling the well that you have to draw from. Like reading that history, reading that ancient stuff, and having plenty there, so when it's time to reinvent, you have something to work with. So I'm curious about your take on that and whether you're consciously like drawing from these old histories and these old stories when you're writing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I never have enough time to read. That's what we all complain about. And so I'm trying to read contemporary literature and literature by, people who are colleagues, and then also digging into historical books and tales, folklore, legends, etc. I think the more you have, the better. I teach undergraduates at A&T, which is a historically black university. And one thing I tell them is to go looking somewhere other than the white European background, which most fantasy started from. I mean, you have the whole Tolkien and onward, where you've got elves and dwarves and dragons and fairies and, kind of that particular pantheon, which comes out of, Northern European legends. And that's fine. It's enjoyable. I love Arthurian legends and all. but there's so much more. And I say, go looking in other places so you don't have to have, the same palette to work from, because there's such a richness in the world that you can go into other places. And of course, we're seeing that now. We're seeing Afrofuturism and books that are coming out from other traditions in Asia and Africa, and really widening our scope of what it means to look at a fantasy in the past or science fiction in the future, that they're going to look different than a whole bunch of white guys on horses, which was kind of the stick for a long time.
Yeah, and given that, like, your experience with that, and like your surveys of those kind of sources you're drawing from, both traditional and non-traditional, I feel like I'm ready to hit you with perhaps the simplest yet the toughest question of them all. So, Valerie Nieman, what is your favorite monster of all time?
Oh, that's so hard. Oh, I'm going to throw something in that's going to be different. I'm going to say the Flatwoods Monster.
Oh, tell us more.
The Flatwoods Monster is a West Virginia monster, and West Virginia has some very interesting monsters. But this one arrived in the early 1950s when supposedly a craft was seen landing, and when people went to investigate, a very tall creature, 10 or 12 feet tall, with a head shaped like the ace of spades, and glowing red eyes and a green body was seen. Many people saw this. So, of course, the standard thing with ufology and all of that is, what could it have been? And the explanations that were given was that it was a barn owl. Which, man, I have a hard time going from a barn owl to a 10-foot tall thing with glowing red eyes and a strange hooded headdress kind of thing. So, I don't know what happened with the Flatwoods Monster, but I just love it. I love the visuals of it. They have a Flatwoods Monster Museum now in Sutton, West Virginia. So if you're driving that way, you can stop and see the images they have. It's a small town monster. There are many of those. There's the Mothman and the monsters on Chestnut Ridge up in Pennsylvania, and all of these sort of local cryptids, which are just fascinating. I mean, as wonderful as the classic monsters are, it's kind of fun to get back in your own backyard and look for things that are not as well known and very quirky.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't unique to West Virginia. You're right. Like, every local area has some of their own monsters and supernatural legends. But in West Virginia, you particularly have quite a bit. I think the Mothman probably got most famous out of West Virginia. But you even have, if I'm recalling correctly, do correct me if I'm wrong on this, that the wood chipper witch murders of the Rainbow Children or whatever, I forget exactly what it was happening in West Virginia. So you had like modern witch hunts there as well. Does that sound right?
Well, if you're interested in some of these folk tales, West Virginia is very rich because there were so many immigrant peoples who came in there, both to settle and then later to work in the mines, the glass factories, the chemical factories. So people from all over the world, all bringing their traditions in. But there was a folklorist at Fairmont State. Fairmont was where I lived and worked, named Ruth Ann Music. And she collected these, and she had 2 or 3 books, but the most famous one is the Telltale Lilac Bush. And this is a story that is true. A ghost convicted a man of murder. A woman died, and her mother kept being visited by her daughter's apparition saying, I was murdered. It had been ruled that she had fallen downstairs or something like that. And so she wouldn't leave her mother alone. And so her mother pestered the authorities, and they said, okay, we're going to exhume the body. And the ghost had given very detailed information about how her husband had choked the life out of her. And when they did exhume her and check the body, this in fact turned out to be the truth, and the husband was convicted. So that's one of those kind of haunting stories. That's from Greenbrier, Telltale Lilac Bush, a lilac bush on a grave, many, many, many other things. Dead miners leading trap men out, ghost mules. I mean, it's just wonderful, rich folklore. And so you can look these books up. They're still in print, and they're wonderful little accounts that come right out of the territory.
That's cool. And as embarrassing as it is to admit, yet I continue to admit embarrassing things on this podcast for some reason. I think I knew about the ghost conviction through Drunk History on Comedy Central. I think they had an episode on that.
It's just so quirky. It's weird and wonderful. And, I think America has all of this richness in it that, when we look at, not trying to beat down anybody, but we look at, Hollywood or mass media and stuff, and you don't get a lot of that. You don't dig into that kind of things. Although I think, occasionally you do. And that's where I like to work. My most recent poetry book, was set at a carnival with the creatures and, acts, in the sideshow. And that's another very interesting world, and one that Bradbury explored and other people have explored. But I think there are so many places that we can go, and the more, the merrier.
Yeah, and are you referring there to Leopard Lady? Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and that's that has a fantastic, for anybody familiar with the old Freakshow posters, that has a fantastic cover. It really draws on that tradition. I really like that.
Oh, I'm glad you like it. I did it.
You did that? No kidding? Man, that's spot on for the old school carnival freak show posters, that some collectors go wild for. That's exactly right.
I went to Coney Island. They have a class at the Coney Island Museum. And you can go up there, you can learn how to be a sideshow performer and learn how to be, a sword swallower, fire eater, et cetera, et cetera. I chickened out and I took the banner painting class and worked with a phenomenal artist, Marie Roberts, and learned how to do this, as you say, traditional folk art, which was done by people in the carnival, where they would paint these banners with the creatures, and these would be hung outside the sideshow. So I was trying to learn, more about who Dinah was. And so I signed up and went up to Brooklyn and spent a week at Coney Island and painted, and had a lot of great encounters that fed into that book, including giving me the last poem, the poem that closed it. So that was great.
Well, that's fantastic. That's really cool to hear. So, let me throw this at you. I vaguely recall seeing this, or maybe you mentioned it in an interview or something like that. And I haven't really got to talk to anybody else on the show about how cool the work of Manly Wade Wellman is. So I'm kind of curious. It seems to have connected a little bit to the kind of folklore you draw from and the kind of folklore you were just talking about. When he came over here and noticed that the Appalachian tales seemed a whole lot to him like a lot of the native African tales he was used to. So do you happen to be a Manly Wade Wellman fan?
I have not read his work in years, but I read it when I was, I think, in my 20s. And I was fascinated with the whole idea of Silver John the Minstrel with his guitar that can, it was a guitar, right?
Yeah, guitar.
That he can fight off the forces of evil. And I think then of Woody Guthrie and this, this instrument slays dictators. But yeah, and he drew on all of those mountain legends of the Southern Appalachians. Of course, he's from North Carolina, from the mountains here. And he pulled that into these series of books. And I also remember discussions about ley lines and all sorts of other phenomena that he just kind of pulled in. That was back before people were too concerned about saying, well, you need to stick to this particular genre and you don't want to cross lines. And he crossed lines, and I think that's wonderful. I don't like the idea we need to stay in a tiny little branded box, which is really what we're told. I was told, you really don't want to cross up mystery and horror and Appalachian because people won't know where to find it, where to shelve it, etc. And that's the way the world is. It's very complex and things cross up. But yeah, I would really recommend that people seek him out. They name an award here in North Carolina. There's a Manly Wade Wellman Award for speculative fiction. So his name is still held in high honor. And that makes me think I need to go back and reread books that I read a really, really long time ago, but they had a strong influence on me. I remember at the same time I was reading him, I was reading, oh heavens, Wilma Dykeman. So same region. She was not working with this kind of genre, but I remember those books together. And they'll always be kind of together in my mind. So, yeah, let's go back and, find some of these classics and bring them back up to life and restore them. I was very happy to hear that Octavia Butler's work is being produced for Netflix or HBO or something. It's like, how long ago were these books written? Let's see. Screen, yay.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction to that. I was thinking, well, about time. Man, this should have been happening for quite some time. And yeah, your approach to boldly and bravely mixing the literary and the genre, I think you're kind of an example of showing how well that can be done and why that old stigma is really fading away. I mean, by the time West Virginia University Press is publishing a book like To the Bones, I'm not sure you could get like a clearer kind of within this system official stamp on something than, say, a university press like them. They're publishing a book that mixes the supernatural with the realistic. Like, by the time West Virginia University Press is making it happen with a book like To the Bones, it's quite possible to mix them and suffer no ill consequences. I think that's pretty cool of you.
I was really, really happy when WVU. I really didn't think that would happen. I had a different book with the press that was being considered. And I met with the acquisitions editor, and we talked about it. And I mentioned just in passing, I'm finishing up this zombie book set in West Virginia. And she said, oh, that sounds really interesting. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, I want to see it. And so they passed on the other book, but they took To the Bones, and I was just ecstatic. I mean, I was so happy. And of course, academic publishing takes a long time, and you have the peer reviewing, and you feel like you're never going to find out, if they're actually going to publish it or not. And when I did, I just was over the moon. So, they've done a beautiful job, beautiful cover, and it's wonderful to be in such great company. Their books, their line is so strong. Right now they've got books that are just phenomenal, with everything from LGBTQ literature out of West Virginia to eco and eco-justice, ecological and environmental issues, with mountains piled on mountains. And they're going flitting away from me as I'm trying to think of the titles. Great novels, great story collections, and Appalachian Reckoning. That's what I was after. Appalachian Reckoning that looks at the kind of the issues that were raised by hillbilly elegy and is a response from the people who live there and work there and who are able to respond to some of those characterizations. And it's a little strange for me because for the first time in my life, I'm actually outside of Appalachia. I live about 20 miles from the border of Appalachia. And I grew up in the northern part, and then was in West Virginia for many, many, many years, and now I'm in North Carolina, and but I've never left. I mean, that's where my heart is. That's where, that's where I draw my ideas, inspiration. It comes from those years wandering the hills and fishing and farming and doing the things I did.
That's really cool to hear. This has been a really fun conversation, and perhaps we should let listeners know where they can go to find out more about Valerie Nieman and her work. So where should we direct them?
Well, I have a website, of course, valnieman.com. My name is spelled inside out. People go looking. It's Nieman. So I have to put that in. But my press is the ones where you would find my books, Press 53, which is also your publisher with your wonderful stories. People, you need to read Josh's stories about fighting monsters and other wonderful things.
Thank you, by the way.
So Press 53 for my poetry and also one novel. West Virginia University brought out To the Bones, which came out last spring. And I also have the novel that came back to life, which I'll mention, Nina Gathering, which was my first book, which is science fiction set in Appalachia and has a monster in it. And that came out a long, long time ago. I shouldn't say, people will think I'm antediluvian, but in 1988, and national publication, mergers, acquisitions, those things happened. It went out of print. And then a few years back, Permuted Press wanted to bring back classic post-apocalyptic science fiction. And they put out 2 or 3 books in that grouping, and then they changed hands. They quit doing it. Anyway, Nina came back to life. So Nina Gathering. So that was pretty cool, because it was like a zombie thing, like 25 and it rises from the grave.
That's cool, because that's a rare thing to happen in the book world, and so that's really cool that you got to see it come back to life. Well, again, it's been a fantastic pleasure to talk with you, to meet you over voice online here and meet you on the show, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you so much again for coming on the Monster Professor and digging into the dark and gritty world of Appalachia, as well as the really cool world of supernatural and literary fiction.
Thank you so much. This has been a delight. Thank you again, Josh.